Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, both virtually and in person. I mentioned last time that it's really great to see more people in the room physically. There's only so much animation engagement you can do when you're sitting in front of a screen. So I'm glad that we're seeing more people come in person, but equally glad that we're able to provide these presentations virtually. We will do our best to continue to do that. It is a very fun endeavor for us to be able to continue that post-pandemic. So anyone joining virtually, I hope you enjoy the presentation this evening. A couple of little housekeeping items to begin. For those of you who are joining us in person, we may or may not have forgotten, but please turn your phones on to silent or off. That would be really helpful. And then for those of you joining on Zoom, you're very welcome to engage with the presentation and the speakers using the YouTube chat function. Questions can be submitted, and I'll make sure that it gets asked at the end of the presentation, or they can be sent to, or they can be sent by email to marmus@marmuseum.ca, and that email address will be put into the chat. I will ask the speakers to repeat the questions that are being asked by me via the Zoom, so that, sorry, that's not the other way around. For those of you who are asking questions in person, for you to repeat the questions so those on Zoom know what question was being asked. I try to make sure I provide that interpretation, but sometimes it gets missed or I don't always get the right question. Right, so thank you so much for joining us. This is part 5 of our season 6 of Nautical Nights. One more to go, and it's been a fantastic series thus far. I hope you've enjoyed it for those who've joined from the beginning. I'd like to thank the Kingston Yacht Club for once again allowing us to use their space and to partner with us on this series. It's a great partnership, and we're very grateful to them for that continued partnership. I would first like to acknowledge that the land and the waterways located within the Great Lakes catchment area have a long history predating the establishment of European settlements. The waterways in particular are to be acknowledged as the traditional trade routes of the Indigenous peoples, together providing a network of trade and travel routes essential to communities since time immemorial. The Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston acknowledges that the site it sits on and the water it interacts with to be the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We thank these nations for their care and stewardship over this land and water, and we are committed to sharing this stewardship moving forward. As you very well know, this evening we have 2 speakers joining us, David Moore and Marie Edwards. And I actually asked both of them to provide me with a little bio or something to share about the speakers ahead of time, but I didn't get anything. So, but many of you know either David or Marie, and so you'll know that David is a numerous time alumnus now of our speaker series, and I think that needs no introduction. Fantastic speaker, great historian, and new doctor in Kingston. So very, very grateful to once again welcome David Moore to our podium. And then with them, we have Marie Edwards, who is a volunteer at the Marine Museum and is doing a fantastic job helping us unpack our very, very extensive library and reorganize it with the help as well of Marge Burgraff, who's in the foreground here, and Joanne, I don't know what her last name is. Not sure if she's here yet. Oh, she's in the back. There we go. Brilliant. So thank you to our volunteer librarians. All I know for sure about the speakers this evening is they came together because Marie was interested in doing some family history and had a conversation with David, and who David said, well, why don't you make it a book, and why don't we tie in some kind of Canadian history? And so what we get to this evening is a culmination of their creativity and historiography. Sure. There we go. So we have this evening is the story of the Beauprés in Portsmouth, and I think there might be a little bit of a family reunion going on in here that people may or may not realize. Anyways, please join me in welcoming back David Moore and newly to the stage, Marie Edwards.
Come to the conclusion, just because you're an extrovert, that doesn't mean you're a good public speaker. So bear with me. Good evening, everyone. David will be doing our presentation as he's a much better speaker. I just want to give you a little background as to how Pierre's song came about, although Michelle just gave you the thumbnail of it, no problem. Our family is blessed with a treasure trove of stories and experiences that have been passed down from one generation to another. It occurred to me that our ancestors and those stories needed to be recorded for future generations. In 1996, I stumbled across Ancestry online, and from there, the Beauprés tree was born. Wally Beauprés, an uncle of mine, had started the tree and passed it to me when he found out of my interest. The next major breakthrough was meeting cousin Jane de Beauprés through Ancestry. She had been researching a different branch of the tree, but if you go back far enough, we share the same roots. After that, it was just plugging away, gathering information as I went. 27 years later, I had the great good fortune to meet David, who was interested in gathering information about the Beauprés for his doctoral thesis. I was happy to share any information he needed and even helped him with more research. When he completed his doctorate, I asked him if he would consider helping me put all that research that I had done into some kind of order. I envisioned the book to be more than just simply a family genealogy. And being the historian that he is, he came up with the idea of weaving the lives of the Beauprés through our Canadian history. So by September 2021, we started. By September 2022, we had the third draft written and ready to submit to the publishers. It was our hope that the book would be completed and ready for sale for tonight, but unfortunately that is not the case. On your way out, I've set up a sign-up sheet to enable you to get in line for pre-publishing or pre-purchasing our masterpiece.
That's pre-purchasing, not free purchasing.
Pre-purchasing our masterpiece when we get the word from the publisher as to the exact date and price. So we don't even know that, but I do know it will be very reasonable. Thanks again for all of you for your love and support and for coming. David.
Oops. Well, you see, she's not a bad speaker at all, is she?
Oh.
Well, it's wonderful to be here again. As Michelle said, I have done a number of talks with the Marine Museum here and on Zoom, and it's an honor to be invited back. And it's fantastic to see so many people out here with an interest in Kingston history and maritime history in general. I'm very pleased and impressed. So tonight we're going to talk about the history of a family that first came to North America in 1620, which is quite a long time ago. And Pierre's song, the title of our book, happens about the middle of this story when Pierre Beauprés wrote a lament, really, about the fact that he was a father with 10 of his 11 sons away at war, fighting for the British or working for the British, many of them here and up the lakes, and some in the army in Lower Canada. So you may count your blessings that I'm not going to sing it. And the full text is in the book. I'm not going to go through the full text here, but he is lamenting. He's the sad father of a very large family, and he wanted to sing to dispel his sorrows of his abandoned children who have abandoned him, and rescuing the homeland in the service of the king, who would be George III. So the historic presence here, as I said, began in 1620, here being broadly speaking, but was certainly not confined in Kingston to the end of the French regime in 1760, as you will see. And this saga attests to the large number of French Canadians, largely unknown, who helped build Kingston and Upper Canada, Ontario, and Canada to this day, long after New France became the British province of Quebec. The North American Beauprés clan, as you may have gathered, is quite large today. And we're following one small thread through the history. Several things that this family is not connected to is what they call the Beauprés shore, the Côte Beauprés, east of Quebec City, along the north shore of the river, where the shrine of Saint Anne de Beauprés is located. This was apparently named by early French mariners who saw beautiful meadows and grasses along the shore of the river and called it Beauprés. This family were originally farmers from Normandy. And as I said, they started here, the trace that we've made in 1620 in Quebec. In Kingston, they settled here in the early 1800s. And our story takes this thread through to the 1970s. So Champlain founded Quebec 1608. You see the great man himself there in a painting on the left. And in one of his 20 plus voyages back and forth to France, he brought his wife with him, Helene de Champlain, that you see on the right. As she became well known in the early days of the colony for teaching Indigenous children. And she became the godmother of Hélène de Porte, who is the matriarch of this Beauprés clan. And she was the first infant girl born in New France. There's a little controversy about whether she was born after she arrived here or probably in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the ship that was bringing her here. But one way or another, she was the first infant girl in the colony. And Hélène was her namesake, Champlain's wife. And Champlain actually left her 300 livres, which is $50,000 or so today, in his will. Hélène became a respected midwife, a sage-femme, and taught her daughters the same profession as well. So Louis Hébert is another name that's inscribed on the plaque of the first 47 colonists of New France. He was the first farmer and the first apothecary, and he had only one son, and that son married Hélène de Porte. It was a brief marriage, only 7 years, but she had 8 children. And after she was widowed, she remarried fairly quickly to a fellow named Noel Morin, a wheelwright and cartwright, which were very important trades in those days. And one of her daughters, Agnes, married a fellow named Ignace Bonhomme de Beauprés. And he's the patriarch of the family that we're going to talk about. And they married in 1671. Agnes had a total of 18 children. 8 from her first marriage, 10 from her second, and died at the age of 46. And she's, even besides that, she's an extraordinary woman. Having large families in those days was not unusual. Many died early, many of the infants. But in this case, Agnes was farming in a suburb of Quebec known as now as the Ancienne Lorette. And along came a new governor appointed by King Louis XIV. And Frontenac was appointed because the fur traded colony under private ownership had failed to deliver. So he made it a royal province and sent Frontenac out to make it so. One of Frontenac's duties, according to the king, was to create a farming settlement, much like the British were doing to the south. But Frontenac had his own ideas. He wanted to get rich, and the fur trade was the way to get rich. It was not farming. So Frontenac, all on his own, organized a campaign to come up the river and establish a fort at a place called Cataraqui, now known as Kingston. In 1673, he dragged along hundreds of ordinary farmers from the province, and nobody liked that. And particularly Agnes, who was carrying her 9th or 10th infant baby, nursing her 9th or 10th infant baby. And I don't know, I may look pregnant, but I've never been pregnant. But I can tell you, I can understand that she might be a little ticked with the governor who took her husband away for the whole summer without pay when she had 10 children to look after. So she was charged with insulting the governor. And the record suggests that it was the governor himself who laid the charge. And she had to appear in what's the high court of the colony called the Conseil Souverain, that Frontenac had tried to install himself as the chair of, but they resisted. The colonists resisted, and she was eventually acquitted, which didn't do the governor's temper any good. And he was acquitted. She was acquitted partly because she had a brother on the Conseil Souverain, and partly because they shut Frontenac out. He was not allowed to appear as a witness. So they got their revenge on Frontenac. I think they all had a quiet little laugh around the colony when she was acquitted of insulting him. And she went back to a quiet life, farming and raising children. One son, Noel Bonhomme Beauprés, became a well-regarded surveyor. He died just before the 7 Years' War. And her grandson is the namesake of the title, Pierre Bonhomme Beauprés, who wrote the song. Pierre was 10 when the colony, when New France fell to General Amherst and became the British colony of Quebec, and was just 22 12 short years later, when the Americans attacked the colony from New York and invaded, captured Montreal, and occupied most of Quebec for 6 months. Just before the revolution broke out, Pierre Bonhomme married a woman named Anne-Angélique Martin in May. Lexington and Concord had occurred at the end of April, and the Americans invaded in August and September. Pierre was called up as a militiaman, and his name is on the honor roll of just 710 who defended the citadel of Quebec for 6 months during the winter of 75-76 from siege by the Americans. The recording clerk entered his profession at 22 as marchand, which means merchant, of course. And Pierre, unfortunately, was stuck in the citadel, never saw his firstborn son until the spring when the reinforcements arrived and they drove the Americans out, not to come back until 1812. Post-war, he and Anne-Angélique had children all over the place. Some in Nancy and Lorette next to Quebec, some way upriver in Berthierville, some in Sorel across the river from Berthierville, and at least one in Montmagny. And it puzzled me. This is a big family. I just couldn't imagine them in a cart like Romany gypsies wandering around the countryside. There were no roads. So it had to be, I'm pretty sure, on one of the ubiquitous river schooners, and they probably lived aboard. And he went up and down the river as a merchant. We found no evidence that supports him owning a schooner or being a schooner master at the time, but that's my suspicion. And I guess Anne Angelique got tired of this nomadic existence because in 1791, Pierre got a surveyor's license and settled down in Sorel. During this time, he continued to be involved in the militia as a junior officer. And in 1794, his name came up again because he was one of just 11 militia officers who signed a public letter praising their commander for his wonderful speech after the militia call-up, the general militia call-up of 1794. And this is a difficult time for a French Canadian to declare their loyalty to the king so publicly, because it was just 5 years since the French Revolution had begun overseas, and only a year or two since they had executed the king of France. So the British had instituted a new militia law, and the rumor had been going around that the French Canadians were to be permanently inducted into the army. They're going to be sent to the West Indies, and they would never come home. And of course, they had some reasonable suspicions, because that was almost exactly what happened to the Acadians just a few years, well, generation before. Anyway, Pierre wrote that he thought the speech was a wonderful thing, and he remained loyal as an officer. And you can see here, Montreal's at the bottom left. Then you see Bircheville and Sorel. Sorel's an important place. We'll talk about it in a bit. Then Quebec and Lorette, and Montmagny's down here. So I think the only practical way that this family could stay together and have children in all those places is they were probably living on one of the river schooners. So they settled in Sorel sometime around 1807 or a little later. And Sorel had been a shipbuilding center from early days in New France, partly because it was a strategic location, excuse me, strategic location where the Richelieu River meets the St. Lawrence. The Richelieu River, of course, drains Lake Champlain, and it was the major north-south route for trade. So Pierre and one son bought a property there, and there they lived when the War of 1812 broke out and the Americans invaded again. His son, Amable, and another son, Prisca Dudon, JD for short, learned how to be shipwrights there. They apprenticed in Sorel, which makes sense because Sorel was an important shipbuilding place. So by 1814, Amable, who's another main character in this story, was 18. And the British Royal Dockyard here, where RMC is now, was in the middle of building the largest sailing warship ever to be launched on the Great Lakes, HMS St. Lawrence. And they were desperate for shipwrights. So they hauled them up the river from Lower Canada and Quebec, and to work in the dockyard here. And Amable was one of them, along with his brother. And they were among about 250 others who formed fully half of the entire shipyard complement by the end of the war. And there in the shipyard where they lived and worked, Amable met and married a young woman named Marie Agathe Kess, and she was the daughter of another shipwright from Quebec, from Lower Canada. So there, you probably can't see it, but right here, the clerk has recorded John D. and Amable Beauprés, spelled B-O-P-R-E, one of about 15 different ways we found Beauprés spelled in the records, which complicated our research somewhat. And they were being paid 10 shillings a day to work on the St. Lawrence. And that at the time was about 10 times what an average soldier would make every day. So pretty good living. They had bargained it for it themselves. Most of the shipwrights knew how valuable they were to the British as civilian shipwrights. And so they had struck twice. And in both times, the British during war said, okay, what do you want? So they ended up doing fairly well. This was the ship they built. 112 guns in the end. Crew of 800 or 900 men. The most powerful sealing warship ever launched on the Great Lakes. The Americans retired to Sackett's Harbor and never came out. So basically saved the western part of Upper Canada from speaking American today. So in every respect, she's comparable to HMS Victory, which was Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, as most of you know. And I found it curious as well that she's quite comparable to the largest ship ever built in the shipyard where the Marine Museum is now, the DC Everest, which was roughly the same displacement, 2,000 tons and change. If you took the bowsprit, jib boom, and the mizzen boom, the spanker sail boom, and added that to the length of HMS St. Lawrence, they're almost exactly the same length. So that was just a little interesting factoid. It relates to the size, the real size and achievement of that ship. So here we are. The war was actually over and settled in the Treaty of Utrecht, I think it was, in 1815. But the word didn't get here until March. Pierre wrote the song in the winter of 1815. So his son, Amable, had, of course, several brothers. And some of them, I'll just touch on briefly, joined the Provincial Marine and were sailors for the British Crown here on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Louis was a midshipman at York and 14 years old when the Americans captured York and they took him prisoner of war. And his older brother, Charles, served as able seaman in Barclay's fleet on Lake Erie and was severely wounded fighting the Americans in 1813. And he received a disability pension from the Crown after the war. And I'm given to understand pensions for the 1812 to 14 warriors were rare and hard to get. Pierre's other 6 sons served in the army. One is a quartermaster in Lower Canada, and everyone survived the war, although Charles died young, probably from this saber slash to the leg he took. After the war, Amable must have had some significant skills because the Navy kept him on. This is a painting by Peter Rindlisbacher of one of the ships he worked on at the Naval Dockyard at Penetanguishene, HMS Tecumseh. And I have to give a shout out to Peter. He's a famous maritime historian and artist who has had his paintings presented to the White House. And he very generously consented to let us use this image and the one on the cover of Kingston Harbor. So I hope you don't regret it, Peter. Thank you. Anyway, this is Tecumseh, one of the vessels that's fairly well known. She was built shortly after the war and based up on Lake Huron, where her bones are preserved. And a replica is also there. It also worked on another vessel called the Bee. The Navy downsized in 1820, and Amable and his wife Maria Gath brought their first daughter downriver to Prescott, where they settled and stayed for a number of years. And Edouard, their oldest son, firstborn son, was born there in 1820. There was a lot of wooden shipbuilding work going on in Prescott. It was the shipping terminus because it was the head of the rapids. So all the bateaus bringing goods up from Montreal stopped there and often transshipped all their cargoes to sailing ships who could sail down that far in the river. And in 1828, Amable completed his first commercial vessel there, a schooner named the Prescott. It was reported as the largest on the lake at the time, of 4,500 bushels capacity, which meant she was probably about 80 feet or so. And that became fairly small as the years went on. In 1835, the Rideau Canal opened, and this changed the world in Prescott because very shortly thereafter, all the upriver traffic didn't stop at Prescott. It went up the Rideau Canal and came to Kingston instead. So shortly after that, Edward decides to move to Kingston with his family. But before he did, he built another, Edward, his son, Amable's son, built his first steamer in upper New York State called the Rossi, 1838, just after the rebellions in Canada and around the time of the Battle of the Windmill in Prescott itself. He may not have liked having bloodshed in what was essentially his backyard. So he moved to Kingston and set up shop at the foot of West Street, corner of Ontario, where the Celtic Cross Memorial is today. That was the Beauprés Wharf for several years. And he went into a kind of a family partnership between himself, his son Jean Dieudonne, Isaiah, Edouard, and Pierre, and Jean Dieudonne's son Bruno. And they were called the Messieurs Beauprés, as you might expect. Around that time, or just before they moved here, Kingston Pen opened, and activity began to occur just to the west of Kingston in what became known as a little village of Portsmouth. 1840, all of that accelerated there when a contractor entrepreneur named Dickinson built what became known as the Long Pier. And the breakwater you walk on today there is basically on the same footprint as Dickinson's Long Pier was built in 1840. In the middle 1840s, son Pierre, Amable's son Pierre, was credited as building a dry dock consisting of 3 caissons to hoist ships out of the water to work on them for repairs, instead of running them up on a marine railway, because there were probably only 3 in Kingston. Maurice may be able to correct me on that. But apparently there were not enough marine railways. So Pierre created the floating dry dock, which was an innovation in Kingston history, although was not all that new around the world. And he built that downtown, where they also built a steam barge called the Bristol in 1846. So they were a going concern. And for a time, they worked in both places. 1846, they rented a marine railway in Portsmouth that had been built by someone else, maybe Montreal Transportation Company, I'm not sure at this point, but they rented that and began to build their own boats there, as well as downtown. And the first one was the Prince of Wales. Glided into the water like a duck, says this writer to the Whig. This was a vessel that was formerly about 100 feet and was lengthened about 25 feet. And the workmanship of the builders is said to be of the first order. And we find that later as well. So this is the invasion of Portsmouth by the Beauprés. If you will, you can see Kingston Pens on the right up at the head of Adder's Bay, as it was known. Lot 1 was where the Marine Railway was, and pretty much across the street where the Portsmouth, Edward built a house that's now called the Portsmouth Tavern. Up here at the corner of what's now King and what's now Mowat, the Beauprés family bought 2 or 3 lots and lived there as a family while they worked down in the village, where there was a sewer running down Yonge Street into the corner of the bay. So they probably liked the better air at the top of the hill, as you and I would. Maurice was kind enough to loan us this we've made it a rather poor image, I'm sorry, but you can see the essentials of the Marine Railway. It surprised me when I learned this is not a steam-driven system. This is a horse-driven windlass, and you can see this cross-section. There are 2 horses on the rotating windlass that has a chain running down here attached basically to the carriage on the front of the boat. And they would haul ships out for repair. Alongside the Marine Railway, at the head of the bay, there were half a dozen more railway-like ways where other contractors built ships in parallel. So Portsmouth Harbor was an astonishingly busy place, and there were ships, well over 1,000 tons, wooden ships built there during the 19th century, of which the Beauprés played a big part. So 46, they also built another steamer called Cataraqui, and in 48 completed a schooner scow described as a large vessel downtown for a famous name in Kingston, William Anglin, and added another case onto the floating dry dock. But that was the end, apparently, of the operation downtown for the Beauprés, because later that year, everything is auctioned off. Now, perhaps coincidentally, his son, Prisca Jean Dieudonne, moved to the States forever, and taking his son, Bruno, Amable's nephew, and we don't know why. Maybe they had a family disagreement. Maybe this was a strategic sort of a move that the clan would have a base in the United States. 1848 was just after what they called the Oregon Crisis, when Fort Henry was completed, and everyone for a while thought the British Empire was going to go to war again. So maybe it was partly getting a foot on the other shore. We don't know. They never came back. So Edward, Amable's oldest son, who was born in Prescott in 1820, became the leading shipwright of the family during this period. And one of the first ships he built in Kingston, he said he helped to build. It was built at George Walt's shipyard at Portsmouth, but Edward says he worked on it and probably played a leading role. And he certainly was invited aboard the Comet and was on her first transit of the new St. Lawrence canals to Montreal, the first lake boat to do that. So Edward purchased those lots up at Mowat Street in King, where Tim Hortons is now, in 1849. This is a lovely drawing of the Comet, thanks to the Marine Museum. Side wheel steamer, as many were during the time. Propellers were an innovation that didn't catch on until a little bit later in the century. Now, Edward was an interesting fellow for sure. In 1851, he got married, but it wasn't just, courtship that was conventional. He was away from home in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And somehow he and Anne Esther Moffat met. and fell in love and eloped and were married across the river in Lewiston, New York, for some reason. And Edouard continued to work. We don't know whether he was on a ship or working in Chicluna's shipyard at St. Catharines. Anyway, he couldn't come home with her to introduce her to his mother. So he put her on a friend's boat, apparently, and sent her to Portsmouth, saying, "Go and introduce yourself, honey." and these were the days when the Catholics and the Protestants hated each other's guts. And of course, the Beauprés were staunch Catholics. So I could only imagine what that scene must have been like. I think Anne Esther Moffat must have been a very brave woman too. So 1863, the patriarch Amable dies. And that year, Edouard began to build what is now the Portsmouth Tavern as a home for his family across the street from the shipyard. And it became quite famous because he built it like a ship with apparently a 36-inch square block of oak timber as a keel, and then built frames out from it. And apparently the Queen's Architecture School used to come and visit and look down in the basement at the structure before going for a beer. So the tavern remained either as a tavern or as a private home in the family until 1974. And it's rarely referred to as Beauprés now, but a few years ago, that was how it was known. Possibly Edouard's greatest shipbuilding achievement was this ship, a three-masted schooner named Oliver Mowat. And he launched her in 1873, built at Millhaven, just west of here, near Bath. And this was quite an event. There were 3,000 people attending, including the Premier, who the ship was named after, Premier Mowat, and his, I think his wife christened the Mowat as she was launched. There were excursion steamers who came from Kingston. And in the book, there's a lovely description by the Whig editor who was on one of the steamers and described the day in, somewhat sarcastic detail sometimes. Well worth reading, so we put it all in the book. But I won't read it to you today. So this was one of the most fascinating things that we discovered that Marie had from a cousin. This is a not unnaturally sepia tinged photograph from a glass slide of an oil painting by a famous painter, a maritime painter named Nicholas Henderson. And you see one of his on the chimney right there. I had no knowledge of this being his or that it had ever been done. But apparently somewhere in the world, and we don't know where, I don't think it's in the museum. We're still looking. We're still looking in the museum to see if it's there, because they have others of Nicholas Henderson. Anyway, this is the Mowat blowing out sails in a storm. And the intriguing thing about this was that Nicholas Henderson said he was aboard that day. So he painted from first-hand experience. Mowat survived, as many did. She went ashore a couple of times and was repaired. Maurice contributed this lovely photograph of what may be the Mowat. We haven't confirmed it yet, but she looks like it. She's the right color, pretty much the right size, it appears. And this is the Mowat sailing in to where the Sibco buildings are. There used to be a huge coal dock. And it looks to me, one of the cargoes that they all carried was coal, along with stone and other unromantic things. And it looks to me the Mowat is going in. That's one of the yacht club. Whoops, you can't see my finger, can you? Sorry about that. That's one of the yacht club boats there. And there's the Marine Museum shipyard there. She's heading in, which looks like to me she's heading for the coal dock at the Simcoe. Anyway, quite an evocative photograph. If it's 1920 or 21, it's one of the last pictures of the Moet ever taken, because in 1921 summer, she was sadly run down and sunk by an iron steamer at night in the middle of the lake, drowning her captain and his wife, and I think one other crew. And the crew of the steamer, the officers were convicted later of not keeping watch and were jailed. Anyway, it was a sad end for a 50-year-old wooden ship. And Tom Rutledge, I don't know if he's here tonight, but if he is, thank you so much. If you're not, thank you anyway. Tom's a diver, and he has made this sketch of the wreck of the Moet out off Prince Edward County. And you can see in the middle there, there's these gashes where the steamer practically cut her in two. And one of the curious things about the schooner wrecks, and there were a lot of them, the Great Lakes are some of the world's most wreck-strewn coasts. And that's a quote from a historian. Is that when they sank, this was she was 130 feet, her masts would stick up 130 feet roughly. So if the water's only 100 feet deep, the mast would be sticking 30 feet out of the water. And they identified many of the wrecks by the fly that they flew on the masthead that way. So they had to send a diver down to dynamite these bars so they didn't constitute a navigation hazard. So hopefully I'm getting close to the end, I promise. All told, the Beauprés brothers and sons built at least 30 wooden steamers and schooners, either here or at Portsmouth or in places all around. One brother went up to Wisconsin, and the last boat they built was up on Lake Nipissing. Anyway, they're beautiful vessels. They look more beautiful than they were in many ways because they were just simply bulk cargo ships carrying unromantic cargoes like stone and coal and wheat and barley. But they're pretty nonetheless. This is another one, the Nellie Hunter, that he built in 1874. And then the Annie Falconer, which the divers know well as a wreck near Kingston. And this is the Annie Minnis, photograph of her taking on wheat or grain of some kind. I think it probably is Port Hope, but I'm not sure. Anyway, they were all just workaday schooners, and the men worked very hard on them. And many Beauprés who were not shipwrights were captain and crew on these ships as well. So Portsmouth Village was incorporated in 1859, and Scud Edouard was elected to the first city council. They were founders of Portsmouth, and he became the tax collector for the village and the assessor, and was known to be incorruptible. And he did that until he retired at the age of 83 in 1903. So they never fired him. He died a few years later in 1908. This is the house he built a few years after he built it in 1880. This is 1934, hadn't changed a bit. And this is one of his sons, Peter Moffat, PM, who inherited the house. And in 1934, when Prohibition came off and he retired as a prison guard, he opened it up again as a tavern. And there he is taking care of business. And you can see that what looks today odd corner door was quite common in those days. There's another one in the village right near to it. And then this is the smokestack of the Quebec heater, that wood burner that heated the place on the main floor. One of Edouard's brothers was named Remigius, and he too apprenticed in the ship trade, but as a young man became a well-known hotelier in downtown Kingston. You see here an ad for Beauprés Hotel at 4 Market Square. Now, Market Square as an address doesn't really exist now, but we think if this is Market Street, this was in a building between where the credit union is and where Tirnanog is, in one of those stone buildings, was 4 Market Square. A convenient place because the ship's all docked right in front. This is his ad. The Beauprés are nothing if not entrepreneurial. They set up a really well integrated business. The Badens were farmers at the time out in Portsmouth, and they married a Baden, so they got fresh produce for all their hotels and their ships. And Remigius went into the wine business, and this is a wine jug of his. You can't really see the legend, but it's there. It says our Beauprés, whoops, back up. Our Beauprés Wines and Groceries, Anchor Building, Market Square. And of course, the Anchor Building still exists, Kingston, Ontario. And the Anchor Building is there on the corner of Brock and King. And this is a picture you can see here. I think you can see it says Beauprés Hotel on that brick building on the right. It's hard to see. That's too bad. Anyway, it says Beauprés Hotel. And this is the Barnum and Bailey Circus elephants parading up Brock Street from the harbor in 1885, past the Beauprés Hotel, where the customers are out on the balcony watching it go by. So Peter Moffat married Annie Leahy, his first wife. And this is just a picture of him as a young man with Stan and May, who were his first 2 children. Peter was a mariner who became mate on the schooners, but retired from that profession early after the schooner he was sailing in got struck by lightning. And it knocked cold all the crew of 5 or 6, and he woke up. And so you could say today he was woke. And his crew were not. And he sailed that vessel safely to port. And when he got back to Portsmouth, the legend goes, he knelt and kissed the ground and said, "I'm never going to sea again." And he didn't. He became a guard at KP and rose to become the quarry master, and had several adventures as a guard, catching inmates who were trying to escape. This is a picture in the back center of Peter in early uniform at KP. This is him with his second wife, Helen, who is nicknamed Henner, who enjoyed a very happy marriage for a very long time. They were instrumental in building the Church of the Good Thief, a Catholic church at the top of the hill in Portsmouth Village, which was constructed from stone quarried by KP prisoners, and he was the quarry master. They donated a window, the window on the left, and Mr. and Mrs. Basil Keane, Marie's grandparents donated this window. So I'm going to finish off soon. I promised that, I know.
You're fine.
Okay, good. This was the last in a long line of Beauprés mariners. In 1957, Leo Beauprés, who was a cousin, became what we understand was the youngest captain ever certified on the Great Lakes. And he, for a while, owned Pike Salvage Company in Kingston. And this is him at the helm of the Salvage Prince. pulling a freighter off a rock in the seaway in the Thousand Islands. And the interesting thing about that is the personal connection to me, because I grew up neighbors with Leo Beauprés, and his daughter Andrea was my sister's best friend, and they're still in touch. But I didn't know any of that until we began to research this. So a wonderful personal connection in the end. This is the port as it is now. Peter Moffat Beauprés passed away in '56. Leo passed away in 1963. And the Portsmouth Tavern was sold by the Beauprés for the first time out of the family in 1974. And there our story ends. Thank you very much. Okay, so any questions from the floor? That's great. Yeah, one right over there.
How do you do? I'm Ron Beauprés.
Ron Beauprés. Hey.
Thank you for mentioning my forefather, Francois Charles Beauprés, who was the one that was wounded in the war.
Oh, wonderful.
His wife was alone, where he might have been there and unable to fend off the Americans, because when the British fleet was taken, that opened the door for these marauders that came across the lake, and they started raising farms in southern Ontario. When they got to the Beauprés farm near Forbes, they tried 3 times to burn it down, and she put the flames out where it fell apart.
Wonderful.
The commander came along and told him to get out of there. She's a brave woman that serves pulling the road.
Great story. Thank you, Ron. I should just interject that Ron's a very famous maritime photographer. Don't let him be humble on you at all.
My forefather, Francois Charles, was born on the 12th of January, 1778, along with his twin brother in the village of Lancienne.
That'll be Ancien Lorette. Yeah.
Yes. Pierre was born there on the 23rd of February, 1753 in Loretto.
Right.
Now, 2 of Francis' daughters, two of his children, Sophia and Edward, were born here in Kingston. First Sophia in 1802 and Edward in 1804.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. I'm very sad to not be able to include some of those details in this talk. A lot of them are in the book, but 45 minutes is, hopeless to include everything you want.
Yeah.
I don't want to take over. The schooner Gladstone that lies as a wreck at Southampton was built in Battersea by a Beauprés in 1869. Which Beauprés was it?
Well, that's a good question.
I don't know my computer with me. There's so many, but I think Ron, it's either Edouard Isaiah or Pierre Rene. I can tell.
And there's another possibility, not to throw a wrench in the works.
Thank you very much.
But we know one of the complicating things was that there were several families not related to each other named Beauprés in Kingston at the same time. And 2 of them were shipbuilders as well. So this one, the Gladstone, maybe did we establish that? It was one of this families, okay, because there was a fellow, what was his? Joseph.
The black sheep.
Yeah, Joseph was the black sheep of the Beauprés, and I'm happy to say he was not related to this part of the family. Any other questions? At the back, Hal.
I heard Ron say that a boat was built in Battersea.
Yes, sir.
Well, is that where Beauprés Island?
Well, Beauprés Island is up there. I don't know if that's where it was. Michelle knows.
Try and repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was Beauprés Island up on the Rideau Canal the place where a Beauprés built the schooner Gladstone? And I don't know. I would. Sorry, go ahead, Mary.
I know one boat that we have the record of was built on Beauprés Island. She was a scow. I just don't remember which one, but I have it written down. So we can tell you, no problem.
Thank you. Good question. Michelle.
We have a couple questions online here. Let me go back. First comes from Charles. How could one live on a river schooner through a Quebec winter?
That's a very good
Liz is
question.
on the-
That's a very good question, but you know, none of the houses had insulation in those days. They all had iron stoves, and the iron stoves, Quebec heaters, were also present on the schooners. CHJ Charles Henry Snyder writes as his time as a mate that in the forecastle, the forecastle of all these schooners where the crew lived, there was an iron stove wood burner. So they would keep as warm on the boat as they were ashore, I'm pretty sure. Does that help?
I'll let you know. All right, next question online is from Nancy. Would the building materials for the ships have come from local suppliers delivered by water or land?
That's a very good question too. The answer was that many of the shipyards were established where they were, partly because they had a sloping shoreline that they could launch boats easily, but also there was good wood nearby. But gradually, as that wood got used up, they had to begin hauling timber from much farther away. I think that's why the Beauprés actually moved from building boats in Portsmouth and Kingston to building them in Millhaven and elsewhere, because there was still wood there, and it was cheaper as well. But they would haul it here by both wagon and ship. Maurice.
I can hardly recommend that you walk over to the Green Museum, open the front door, and directly ahead of you, you'll find this magnificent model of the St. Lawrence.
Wonderful.
It's got all the detail you could possibly want.
Wonderful.
Reason to visit the museum.
Wonderful. Thank you for reminding us of that, Maurice. For the folks on Zoom who come to Kingston, if you visit, as I'm sure you will, the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes, inside there is a lovely scale model of HMS St. Lawrence. Thanks, Maurice. Yeah.
Quick observation, the Beauprés operated the marine railway that was the furthest in Portsmouth. So they had that at one point. Only a couple of years later, Holt took over that marine railway.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yes.
he was working for Holt. He was actually working where he'd been running the place.
Right.
More importantly, Holt was also operating for a brief period of time a marine railway in Ogdensburg. I'm betting Beauprés was left in charge of the one in Portsmouth.
Well, Walter, thank you so much. That's wonderful perspective on things. It's Walter Lewis is here. I'm very flattered that he's come all the way from up the lake near Toronto, and he's an amazing historian. And if you ever look for something called the Maritime History of the Great Lakes online, Walter created the whole thing, and you can search everything in it. It's unbelievable. He deserves a medal. Thank you, Walter.
Sorry, can you repeat the comment?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. The comment was that about the marine railway that the Beauprés rented in Hatters Bay, at the head of Hatters Bay, that this was later taken over by George Ault, that I mentioned the Beauprés had worked for. And they also operated one in Ogdensburg. So it's quite likely that Ault delegated to the Beauprés to run the marine railway in Portsmouth Village. Yeah, Ron.
The French technique for designing the hull of the schooner was to build a half model first. I was sitting in the Marine Museum in Toronto. That's when it was in the barracks before they moved it down to the harbor, and then it all disappeared. I was sitting there next to Captain Jerry Orkirk, and he says, "Hey, Ron, take a look at what's beside you on the wall." And I looked, and it was a half model car by a Beauprés. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get the Historical Society of Toronto to locate this artifact that is now in a warehouse someplace and get it to Kingston where it belongs?
Ron, we're ahead of you. I'm so glad you brought that up. Ron brought up the fact that in Toronto, there are carved half holes that were used. There's 3 of them actually that we discovered, 2 that were donated to the Toronto Museum and are now in storage. And Doug is diligently looking into how to get them to Kingston because they all represent Kingston history. Thank you. Michelle.
The other question on YouTube here. Where'd it go? Oh my gosh, sorry. Okay, so it's yet another question from Charles. Were the Beauprés the actual people who built the ships, or did they tend to be the people who made it happen? So the designers, foremen, financiers, or maybe all of the above?
Well, they were certainly both. The master shipwrights often directly did the work, and if they were parsimonious, like many of the shipwrights were, they did all the work. But in many cases, they had crews of apprentices and people who were not so skilled working underneath them. So I would say both. But the shipwright is the one who gets the credit for building the ships.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. It's been a delight. Thank you again. Terrific.
Thank you very, very much, David and Marie. You did a fantastic presentation, lots to learn here, and certainly had me kind of piecing together my growing knowledge of Kingston's maritime heritage. So thank you very, very much for a fantastic presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us both in person, wonderful, and online. Thank you very much. Again, thank you. So I mentioned this was part 5, which means that so it's the penultimate episode of Nautical Nights. Next week marks our last installment of the winter series and is with Dan McFarlane. The title of the presentation is Fixing Niagara Falls, Manipulating the World's Most Famous Waterfall. So I think my understanding gets a bit into the environmental, the politics of this beautiful piece of nature and environment and the world, really. Anyways, very, very excited about this one as well. And so I hope you will join us again next week, either in person or virtually, and you're welcome to do so. Thank you again for coming. I hope you had a lovely evening. Feel free to stick around, I think maybe a little longer. And otherwise, thank you again.
Thank you for fun. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here. There he is.